Good morning, this is Matthias again at Carolina Raptor Center. Hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk to you about feathers. So obviously feathers are a really important part of all birds. All birds, even flightless birds, have feathers of some type. So let's talk about more detail. And I started researching this and I realized I know very little about feathers. Emphasis on little. It's pretty amazing what's out there. But I'll show you a couple things and you can continue your own research. So there are lots of purposes for feathers. The obvious ones are allowing the bird to take off, lifting the body off the ground. They use their tail as a rudder basically to steer, but also to brake. If you see a bird in slow motion especially coming in for a landing, their tail opens up and slows them down as they approach a perch. Everybody's heard about downy feathers. They're great for insulation, so birds originated that theme. Feathers are good for protection. It gives a predator something else to grab besides the body of your bird. Camouflage, we'll see some pictures in a minute. In some species, waterproofing is obviously very important, but it's true for all birds. To some extent, they are waterproof. We test birds sometimes when we're not sure. Literally, a spritz bottle of water, and you spritz them on their back, and it'll roll off. Now, if you continue to spray them with water, eventually it'll soak through. But even for the average hawk or owl, they are somewhat waterproof. Some feathers are very much modified. We'll see some examples of that in a minute. Another purpose is directing sound. We'll talk about ears. And finally, sending out signals or communicating with the world around you. So lots of purposes for feathers. There's a nice big primary from an eagle as an example of a feather. So how is a feather built? What is a feather? So you have, for the average feather, again there's lots of variation, we'll see variations of that, but the average feather has a central shaft called a rachis. It has two portions, two flaps, you could say, on each side. They're called vanes. And then everybody's heard of this. If you look at this close-up, here's the shaft. Here are these vanes, which are made up of barbs. And those barbs are interlocking by these barbules, two different kinds of barbules. Some are straight and some are hooked, like these up here. And so they interlock to form one solid shield, basically. One surface that allows the bird to either catch some air with it or protect itself. When you see a bird preening, what they're doing is rearranging these barbs and barbules so that they're interlocking again if anything's disturbed them. Where they come from, so each individual feather comes from a small section of tissue called a feather follicle. Has excellent blood supply, muscles attached to it, and out of this little spot grows feather, anything from a teeny tiny downy feather to that primary on an eagle that we saw. Here you see an image of a feather, what we call a blood feather. So there's again good blood supply in the middle while the feather is growing. Once the feather reaches full size, that blood supply will be terminated, will be cut off, and it will no longer have blood inside the shaft. And as I mentioned, one follicle produces one feather. So if it needs to grow a new feather, that old feather has to come out first. So where do feathers grow? So if you look at an average bird like this screech owl, you'd think, well, he's just covered in feathers. And that's true from the outside. But if you look closer, if you examine this bird, he won't like it, but you can. Feathers will actually grow in tracts or rows, very distinct for the different species. So there are left some areas that are actually bare. No feathers there, you just have to find them. So you'd have to dig around in this screech owl to find where his bare spots are. We utilize those bare spots in some cases in the rehab process. If we want to look at something rather than trying to peel apart all those feathers or applying rubbing alcohol to wet the feathers down temporarily, if we just look for those bare spots, we can get access to the underlying tissue, the skin, the muscle, everything.
So it's kind of like parting your hair, just parting
your hair, yeah. And if you part it in the right places, you'll find these big areas that are surprising how large some of these open areas are. So they help us in some cases. So let's talk about the different kinds of feathers. The main one that you're familiar with, because it's what's visible on the outside, are what's called contour veined feathers. That means they have a central shaft of some type, and they have these veins on each side, and they have a varying amount of down attached. Obviously some have very little, like this flight feather has barely any down left, but some of these others are very fuzzy. And that just means there aren't any barbs or barbules on these veins, so they can't interlock, so they're frilly. So these contour feathers are the main feathers that give the body the shape that you've seen, an aerodynamic shape, and they also give you lift and braking and drag and all that. So these are very important, and that's, the first thing you see when you look at a bird is pretty much all these contour feathers. But there are lots of other feathers that are usually hidden. Some called semi-plumes, which are all downy but still have a shaft. So mostly used for insulation. There are what everybody knows, downy feathers, which actually do not have a central shaft anymore. And I couldn't get a good picture of these, so I had to steal pictures from various websites because it was pretty much impossible. Obviously very good for insulation. And actually insulation works both ways. It's insulating from heat and from cold. You don't usually think about from heat, but they can obviously they can get too cold if they don't have enough down, but they can also get too hot. So they can trap cool air with those downy feathers and keep heat out. There are other feather types called bristle feathers. And there we see a close-up of a barred owl beak showing all kinds of bristle feathers. So they will be like the whiskers on an animal to sense them, help them sense what's around them, what's close to their beak, for instance. These are found all over the body as well, along with these others called filoplumes. They're sensory, so the bird has to know where it's going, what's happening around it. So some of them will kind of stick out outside of the body, and they will tell it what the wind looks like, what the air pressure looks like, and they also tell the bird how its feathers are aligned, because the big feathers don't necessarily have nerve endings attached, but these do. So when something moves a feather, these will tell them, okay, my feather's moving, something's happening on this wing, or there's air pressure, it's changing, or something along those lines. So these are very important. The bird kind of senses what's going on around it with these feelers, so to speak. And last but not least, something called powder down, which are the only feather I found a reference to that's actually ever growing, so it doesn't molt out and be replaced. Continuously grows, and as the bird preens, it breaks up into this talcum powder-like substance that helps them probably with cleaning feathers and with waterproofing. And some birds have more than others. If you think about birds that need waterproofing more, like waterfowl, they probably have more of these, and they have patches of them that the bird can access. Come on. Let's talk about color real quick. So color is obviously very important to birds. I feel like I might have skipped a step, but anyway. Color comes from various sources. Sometimes it's pigment that's actually found in the feather, and that pigment can be from the diet. So they literally are what they eat, and we see that sometimes in captivity when you're feeding birds certain prey items that are very bright yellow-orange. The cere, the nose, so to speak, can turn bright yellow, and the feet can too. So they incorporate what they're eating into the coloration. So different kinds of pigments that result in different colorations. There's also another way for them to be colored. So if you think about a bluebird, they actually are not blue. It's just that the structure of their barbs and barbules is such that blue is the only color that's reflected when sunlight hits them. There's no blue color on them.
Wow.
Yeah, and the same is true for iridescent colors. We all love, hummingbirds, for instance. Same thing happens there. There's just different ways that the light is refracted when it hits their feathers. So feathers are pretty amazing, down to the microscopic level. So here's just an example of all the different colors that birds can make, which is just amazing. course, in most raptors, you don't find that many bright colors. There are some exceptions, like kestrels are pretty bright, for instance, but most of them are more earth tones. They try to blend in. Color can vary within each species. For instance, in some birds, you have phases, color phases, like screech owl, gray and red. But there's also just a general variation among all species. No two great horned owls are alike.
So those are two great horned
owl tails. Not related to age or sex or anything, just variation. And you can find anything in between. There are some examples of birds that show dimorphism between the sexes, meaning two colors, dimorphism. So here's a male American kestrel and a female American kestrel, and quite different in the color of the back and the color of the tail, male, female. So again, these colors are helpful to them in terms of communicating with their environment or their mates, potential mates. So color has many purposes. So all these guys have pretty much an active lifestyle of some kind or another. Some more so than others, I suppose, but especially juvenile birds like this juvenile red-tailed hawk. They go through a lot trying to survive their first year, for instance. The first year is always tough for birds. So there's a lot of wear and tear, and that's why molting is so important. So literally, feathers will wear out. If you look at this barred owl feather up close, notice how the white part is almost worn through versus the darker part. So the white part, by definition, is weaker. It doesn't have enough melanin. It doesn't have as much melanin, the darker pigment, as these areas.
So that's why they molt every year to replace
feathers that are gonna get worn out, no matter whether you're juvenile or adult. Over time, you're gonna wear some out. Hey. You're on TV. Here's an example of another reason why they should molt. Sometimes birds don't get enough food or they're under stress when they're growing feathers. And these stripes across here are actually weak areas we call fault bars. And those are literally so weak that the feathers will break in those particular areas, almost like someone cut them off. So molting happens for a couple of different reasons. One, just a normal seasonal molt, 6 months out of the year, usually during the summer months. They'll replace feathers, and so if you look at this red-tailed hawk tail, you notice pale ones and bright red ones. So the pale ones are the old worn ones. There's some really worn over here. And the bright red ones are the newer shiny ones. So over time the entire tail will be replaced, but not all in 1 year. Here's some new feathers on a barred owl. So usually, again, you can tell they're nicer, they're
a lot darker,
crisper, they're darker, and then over time they will get pale, they'll get bleached by the sun, for instance. There are other molts. For instance, if a bird is injured, they can molt and replace feathers that were damaged. Here's a fracture of an ulna with soft tissue damage here, and some feathers fell out. Actually, see a gap right there on a radiograph. And here the bird is a month later. You see the callus forming, the bone is healing, but there are new feathers. These are blood feathers. They show up on the radiograph because they're much denser. So these are new feathers coming in to replace what's been lost during the injury. And finally, there's another kind of molt that happens usually for females, because females do the incubation. Females will lose or even pluck feathers around the chest and abdomen and develop what's called a brood patch, so they can keep close contact with eggs and young. And then after the young are old enough, they'll replace those feathers, so you see lots of little feathers growing in to recover all those feathers. They need them for insulation for the winter months. All right, and a couple quick little ones here. So we talked about directing sound. That's a very specialized adaptation for feathers. Here's a close-up of a great horned owl. The eye, the ear, which would be behind this black mark on the feathers. And if you flap it open in one direction or another, you'll actually see the ear canal. And the feathers around it help guide sound into that ear opening. They have what's called a facial disc.
Almost like a funnel.
It's a funnel, basically, yeah. So many owls have it. Even some diurnal birds, like northern harriers, have it because they rely on hearing more so than the average hawk.
We have a question, if you could talk a little bit more about blood feathers.
Okay, so every feather, when it first emerges from the body, we call it a blood feather. It's just because it contains blood supply.
I think there also can be called pin feathers.
Yeah, I'm sure there are other names, pin feathers, right? Because they look, when they first come out, they're literally just like a pencil almost, and then the bird uses its beak to preen open the outer covering, and the feather will unfurl. And as the feather gets longer and longer, the bird keeps preening back until the feather is fully emerged. So we have to be careful about those feathers. They're very delicate. They can bend easier than a fully grown feather.
And they can also break
They
too,
can break,
and at that point they can bleed, right?
Right, it can bleed quite a bit. In fact, usually when that happens, if it's truly broken off, and if it's in a rehab or education setting, we have to restrain that bird and pull that feather out with a pair of hemostats. And we have to make sure we pull out the entire feather, including all the way down to the very tip, the part that's embedded in the follicle, because that will stop the bleeding. Once the whole feather is removed, the bleeding will stop, and the follicle now knows, hey, I lost my feather, I need to grow a new one. So you can't leave any part of it in the body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so when the feather is full grown, that might take, a couple weeks?
Several weeks, depending on the length of the feather, maybe even months for the really big primaries.
And then the blood recedes,
Recedes
back into the body.
Yes, right. The shaft will be empty, and if you ever played with a feather, and we used to write with feathers because they're hollow, so you could dip them in ink, and it'll suck up a little bit of ink by capillary action, and then write with it like you used a fountain pen. Basically, that's where the idea came from, the fountain pen.
Yeah, I think
answer
that.
your
Yeah,
question?
definitely.
Okay.
I think so.
Right. A little bit more about communication. So here's a juvenile Mississippi kite and an adult Mississippi kite. So obviously very different in plumage. Same bird, same size, but it tells the environment, hey, I'm an adult versus, oh, I'm a juvenile, I'm not a threat to you, or I'm not ready for breeding, for instance. And in the case of a great horned owl, those ear tufts, which of course are not horns, they're called great horned owl, but they're just tufts of feathers. They could be used for communication between birds, and even to tell us, like usually when they're angry, their ears lay back.
Back off.
When they're alert, and the ear tufts tend to be standing up. And camouflage, I think it's just about my last one. So can you find a screech owl in the right-hand picture? So that's really important for the owls, and for some species as well. But, so there's the barred owl, perched, and there's the screech owl right in there. And finally, if we can get there, I have one other thing to show you if we have time, because it sums up flight really well. I don't know if any of you have seen this. Hey, that's not.
I'll put it back on you.
Skip ahead.
There it is.
That's not it. That's the wrong video. I'm sorry. Well, this might be the end of it because I may not be able to find it as quickly as I thought.
We might be able to share the video later on Facebook.
If you Google goshawk flies through tiny opening, you'll get an amazing slow motion video. This is what it's all about. This is why these birds are so amazing. They shows a goshawk flying through an opening in a captive situation, of course. It's a trained falconry bird. An opening probably about this big, at pretty much full speed. And then they experiment with it, and they vary the shape of the opening that the bird has to fly through. And it's just amazing to watch him, how he's folding up his body to go through these openings at, barely slowing down. That's all I have on feathers today. Hope you learned something. I know I did.
I know, I did too. All right. Thank you, Matthias. Bye, guys.
Bye.